On the 14th of March, 1879, in the old city of Ulm in the Kingdom of Württemberg, a child was born who would one day bend the fabric of space and time. His name was Albert Einstein, and for the first several years of his life, almost nobody had any particular reason to expect that he would amount to anything extraordinary at all. The city of Ulm sat on the banks of the Danube, a modest, prosperous town of merchants and craftsmen, known chiefly for the towering Gothic spire of its Munster Cathedral, which was, at the time of Einstein's birth, still under construction as it had been in one form or another for centuries. The surrounding landscape was flat and agricultural, crossed by rivers and dotted with small villages whose inhabitants had lived in more or less the same way for generations. Germany itself, in 1879, was a new country in the political sense, unified only 8 years earlier under the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, following the decisive defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. But old in every other sense, old in its culture, its universities, its traditions of music and philosophy, and scientific inquiry. It was a country that took ideas seriously, that produced professors and musicians and engineers in great quantities, that believed in the educability of the human mind and in the dignity of intellectual labor. It was in many ways an ideal country in which to be born curious. The Einstein family was Jewish, secular in the way that many educated German Jewish families had become by the latter half of the 19th century. Observing the holidays, maintaining a cultural connection to the tradition, but not strictly religious. Hermann Einstein, Albert's father, was a cheerful, somewhat impractical man who moved frequently in pursuit of business opportunities that rarely quite materialized. He was warm, personable, fond of poetry and of a good conversation, and constitutionally ill-suited to the disciplines of careful financial management. His wife, Pauline Koch Einstein, was the more grounded of the two, sharper, more musical, with a dry wit and a clear-eyed practicality that her son would inherit in complex and sometimes contradictory proportions. Albert was their first child. A daughter, Maria, always called Maha, followed 2 years later, and the two siblings would remain close throughout their lives, bound by shared memories of a childhood that was, in most external respects, comfortable and unremarkable. The family did not stay long in Ulm. When Albert was about a year old, Hermann's business interest drew the family to Munich, the grand Bavarian capital, where Hermann and his brother Jacob set up an electrical engineering company that manufactured dynamos, arc lamps, and measuring instruments, products for the new electrical age that was visibly transforming European cities in the 1880s. Munich in this decade was a city in the middle of a technological transformation. Electric lighting was being installed in the streets and in the great public buildings, and men with the right combination of technical knowledge and entrepreneurial ambition could, in theory, do very well. Hermann Einstein had the technical knowledge. The ambition came and went, and the business sense never quite arrived. Albert grew up in Munich, in a comfortable house with a garden where his sister Maja played among the fruit trees while he sat to one side, arranging building blocks or constructing intricate card houses with a patience and a concentration that were unusual in a very young child. He was, by Maja's later account, a physically gentle child, not timid, but unhurried, as if he were always waiting for something inside his own head to finish forming before he acted. He moved carefully, he spoke carefully. He was also, notably and worryingly to his parents, late to speak. He did not say his first words until he was 2 or 3 years old, much later than normal, and for a period his parents genuinely feared that something was wrong with him. A family doctor was consulted. No diagnosis was reached. When he did begin to talk, he had an odd habit of murmuring sentences quietly to himself before speaking them aloud, as if rehearsing, as if checking his own words for accuracy before releasing them into the world. This habit of internal rehearsal, of thinking a thing fully before expressing it, never entirely left him. As an adult, Einstein was not a rapid conversationalist in the manner of people whose intelligence runs fastest when talking. He was a thinker who thought alone, in images and in the language of mathematics, and who spoke only when he had something to say. This could make him seem remote, or slow, or inattentive. He was none of these things. He was simply somewhere else. The Einstein household was not a conventionally religious one, but it had warmth and a certain cultural richness. Pauline played the piano with genuine skill. She had hoped to be a concert pianist in her youth, and she insisted that both her children learn instruments. Albert began violin lessons at 6, reluctantly. The house was full of music and full of dinner guests. The Einsteins kept an open table on Thursdays for students, particularly poor Jewish students from Eastern Europe who were studying at Munich's universities and who were grateful for a warm meal and a comfortable evening. It was through this tradition that a young medical student named Max Talmud, later Talmy after he emigrated to America, became a regular Thursday visitor, and who gave the young Albert a series of popular science books and, later, a geometry textbook that would change the course of his intellectual life. The moment that Einstein himself, looking back across decades, would identify as the first stirring of his scientific imagination occurred when he was about 4 or 5 years old. He was ill in bed, a childhood illness, nothing serious, and his father brought him a small magnetic compass to play with. It was a simple object, the kind of thing sold in every toy shop and compass maker's stall in Germany, a brass case with a glass cover, and inside, pivoting freely on a pin, a small magnetized needle that no matter which way you turned the compass always swung back to point in the same direction. Albert held the compass and turned it again. The needle moved, swinging and then settling again, always north. He turned the compass upside down. He shook it. He held it close to his chest, and then, at arm's length, the needle continued its patient, unwavering alignment. Nothing was touching it. There was no visible string, no hook, no hand. And yet something was reaching through the empty air and moving it. Something invisible, something without color or weight or sound, was threading through the walls of the room, through the fabric of his nightshirt, through the air itself, and pulling the small piece of magnetized metal toward the pole of the earth with a precision that nothing he had yet encountered could explain. He was 5 years old, and he was trembling, not from fear, but from something he would later describe as a feeling of deep wonder. A sudden, vertiginous awareness that the world contained forces that were invisible and yet absolutely real, that acted through apparent emptiness, that obeyed laws he could not yet name. He would describe this experience, decades later, as one of the formative moments of his life. Something, he said, deeply hidden, had to be behind things. The compass had shown him the hidden thing. He spent the rest of his life trying to find it. His formal education began at the Peterschule in Munich, a Catholic primary school, the nearest one to the family home, and his parents, being secular, had no particular objection to a Catholic institution. Albert was the only Jewish child in his class, a fact that his classmates apparently made him aware of on a regular basis. He was not physically harassed, or at least not seriously, but he was different, and children of that age rarely allowed difference to pass unnoticed. There were days when his classmates marched in military formation in imitation of the soldiers they saw on the streets of Munich, and Albert refused to join in, watching with a distaste for military pageantry that would harden, over the years, into something much stronger. He learned, early, to be comfortable in his own company. He had a few friends, but they were never numerous. He preferred books and his own thoughts to the rough-and-tumble social life of the schoolyard. At 10, he transferred to the Luitpold Gymnasium, the secondary school that would take him through adolescence. It was here that the myth of Einstein as a bad student first took hold, a myth that has since been partially corrected but has never quite died. The truth is more nuanced than either version. He was an exceptional student in mathematics and in physics, where he was often years ahead of what was being taught. He was a mediocre student in Latin and Greek, which bored him profoundly. He was difficult with teachers who relied on rote learning and strict discipline, which in the German school system of the 1880s described nearly all of them. The gymnasium ran on authority, on the memorization of facts, the recitation of rules, the submission of the individual intelligence to the collective curriculum. Einstein's intelligence was not the kind that submitted easily. He asked questions that teachers found uncomfortable, not because he was rebellious, but because he genuinely wanted to know the answer, and could not understand why the answer was not available, or why the teacher was not interested in providing it. He later said that the spirit of learning and creative thought was lost in strict rote learning, and that this was true of every educational system he had ever encountered. The school's response to this was predictable. They marked him as difficult, as someone who disrupted the orderly flow of instruction, as a student who was clever but could not be relied upon to behave as clever students were supposed to behave. One teacher reportedly told the young Einstein that he would never amount to anything. The story may be apocryphal. It has the tidiness of legend. But it is consistent with what we know of how the gymnasium experienced its most famous alumnus. He was not the student they wanted, he was the student they got. What did fit him, during these years, was music. Pauline Einstein had insisted on violin lessons, and Albert had resisted them at first. The early lessons were mechanical, joyless, another form of the drill he found tedious at school. Then, sometime around the age of 12 or 13, something changed. He discovered Mozart. He discovered Bach. He discovered that music at its deepest level was not a system of rules to be memorized, but a kind of order, a pattern of relationships in time, beautiful and precise, obeying internal laws that could be felt even before they could be analyzed. He played the violin for the rest of his life. In his later years at Princeton, neighbors would sometimes hear him playing late into the evening, the notes floating out of the study window into the quiet suburban street. He once said that if he had not been a scientist, he would have been a musician, that music and physics felt to him like two expressions of the same underlying thing. At 12, something else happened. Max Talmud gave Albert a geometry textbook. It was Euclid's Elements, and the effect on the boy was immediate and total. He read it the way some children read adventure stories, with the pages turning faster and faster, with a sense of mounting excitement at what was being revealed. Here was a system of pure thought, a set of axioms and rules, and from those axioms, through the sheer force of logic, an entire world of truths that could not be refuted, that followed necessarily from the starting points. The proof that the square on the hypotenuse equaled the sum of the squares on the other two sides was not something you had to take anyone's word for. You could prove it yourself. Anyone could prove it. The truth was accessible directly to the mind, without authority, without instruction, without faith. He called it the holy little geometry book. He had found in its pages something that the compass had only hinted at, that beneath the visible world there was a mathematical structure, and that the human mind was, in principle, capable of discovering it. He was 12 years old, and the structure of reality was beginning to come into focus. In 1894, when Albert was 15, the family moved again. Hermann Einstein's electrical engineering business in Munich had failed, not for the last time, and new opportunities seemed to beckon in northern Italy, in the city of Milan, where Hermann's brother Jacob had contacts and prospects in the expanding electrical infrastructure of northern Italian cities. The household packed and departed. Albert, however, was left behind. He was in the middle of his secondary schooling at the Leupold Gymnasium, and his parents, sensibly enough, did not want to disrupt his education at a critical stage. He was placed in lodgings in Munich, expected to finish his degree and then join the family in Italy. He lasted about 6 months. Munich without his family was bleak and cold, and the gymnasium without the occasional relief of his parents' warm household was worse than ever. The institution he had found oppressive when he had his family nearby became, in their absence, genuinely intolerable. He was a Jewish boy alone in a Catholic institution in a city that was growing increasingly inhospitable to people like him. The anti-Semitic politics that would culminate 40 years later in catastrophe were already a visible presence in Munich's streets and newspapers, even if their ultimate destination was still unimaginable. He arranged, the precise details are obscure, and various accounts give slightly different versions, to obtain a doctor's certificate stating that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required a rest. He may have been helped in this by a sympathetic teacher who had recognized his situation. He then presented the gymnasium with this certificate and effectively withdrew from school. He was 15 years old without a diploma, and he walked out of Munich and made his way south across the Alps to join his family in Milan. His parents were alarmed. His father, in particular, was worried. Albert was old enough now for the question of his future career to be pressing, and a 15-year-old boy without a diploma and without obvious practical skills was not, in the Germany of the 1890s, well positioned for any kind of respectable life. There was also the question of military service. German male citizens were required to register for military service at 17, and Albert had absolutely no intention of doing so. He found the whole apparatus of military obedience, the uniforms, the drilling, the subordination of individual thought to collective command, the glorification of hierarchy and nationalism, physically repellent in a way that went beyond mere inconvenience. He had watched his Munich schoolmates march in imitation soldiers' formations, and felt nothing but a cold withdrawal. He would in 1896 formally renounce his German citizenship, becoming for a period stateless, in part to avoid conscription, in part because he had decided that he did not wish to belong to the kind of country that Germany appeared to be becoming. Italy was a revelation. He spent a happy year there, traveling through Genoa and Pavia and Milan, visiting art galleries and cathedrals, walking through medieval streets that had nothing in common with Munich's orderly neoclassical avenues. He read widely, thought freely, and wrote a short essay, charming in its ambition and its incompleteness, on the ether and the electromagnetic field, which he sent to an uncle with the touching confidence of a boy who does not yet know that he does not know enough. He was free, for the first time in his memory, from the grinding machinery of German institutional education. The Italian light was warm. The food was good. The people were, by his account, more relaxed and more human than the people he had grown up among. He was, briefly, simply a young man enjoying being alive. But the future had to be faced. His father's business was struggling again in the new Italian context, and Albert could not remain indefinitely in Milan as a guest of his parents' modest hospitality. He needed qualifications. He needed, eventually, a career. The most obvious path for a mathematically gifted young man in German-speaking Europe at the end of the 19th century was engineering or physics, and the best institution for either in the region was the Eidgenössische Polytechnische Schule in Zurich, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, known then and now as the ETH, the institution that trained the engineers and scientists of the Swiss Confederation and had a reputation for rigor and excellence. In 1895, at 16, a year younger than the normal admission age, Einstein sat the entrance examination for the ETH. He failed. His mathematics and physics scores were exceptional, among the highest the examiners had seen. His French, botany, and zoology scores were not. The examiners noted his mathematical gifts with admiration and suggested that he spend another year completing his secondary education before reapplying. The director of the Polytechnic specifically recommended a cantonal school in the Swiss town of Aarau, in the region of Aargau, which had a reputation for progressive and humane education. Aarau turned out to be everything the Luitpold Gymnasium had not been. The school was run on principles influenced by the Swiss educational reformer Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, who had argued that children learned best through direct experience, through experiment, through being asked to think rather than to memorize. The teachers at Aarau encouraged their students to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to form their own opinions, and defend them with evidence and argument, rather than with appeals to authority. There were no beatings, no rigid hierarchies. The atmosphere was, by the standards of the era, unusually free. Einstein later described the year at Aarau as the happiest of his school life, and the contrast with everything that had preceded it was sharp enough to shape his views on education for the rest of his life. He lodged with the family of one of the teachers, a man named Jost Winteler, whose household was warm, intellectually engaged, and hospitable. The Wintelers took their young boarder in with genuine warmth. He became, for that year, almost a member of the family, eating at their table, joining their conversations, walking with them on Sundays in the Aargau countryside. He fell briefly in love with Winteler's daughter, Marie, a gentle, musical young woman, well-suited to him in many ways, who was his first serious romantic attachment. The relationship was warm and genuine while it lasted, but when Albert left Aarau for Zurich, he allowed it to fade with a carelessness that hurt Marie considerably more than he seemed to notice. This pattern, deep absorption in the person immediately present, followed by emotional withdrawal when circumstances changed, would recur throughout his personal life. He also, during the Aarau year, conducted his first important thought experiment. He imagined what it would be like to ride alongside a beam of light traveling at the speed of light and to look at the light wave beside him. What would he see? A stationary wave of electromagnetic oscillation, frozen in space, going nowhere. But Maxwell's equations, which described electromagnetic waves, did not permit stationary solutions of this kind. A frozen light wave was not something Maxwell's mathematics allowed. Something was wrong, either with his imagination or with Maxwell's equations, or with the assumptions about space and time that made the question seem coherent. He could not yet say which, but the question stayed with him, lodged somewhere behind his daily life like a splinter that could not be ignored, through the years in Zurich and Bern and all the years that followed, until, in the spring of 1905, it finally worked its way free. He was also, during this year, reading seriously and widely, not the assigned curriculum, which he found adequate but not exciting, but the works of the scientists and philosophers who were then at the edges of knowledge, the work of Heinrich Hertz on electromagnetic waves, the work of Ernst Mach on the foundations of mechanics, the work of James Clerk Maxwell himself, whose collected papers he worked through with the focused intensity of someone who has found exactly what he has been looking for. Maxwell's equations were, Einstein later said, the most important event in physics between Newton and his own work. The grandeur of them, 4 compact equations that described all of electricity and all of magnetism and all of light, and that implied all of these were the same thing, made an impression on him that never faded. He reapplied to the ETH and was admitted in 1896, entering the teacher's diploma program in mathematics and physics. He was 17. Zurich was a handsome, prosperous city at the edge of a lake, surrounded by mountains whose snow-capped peaks were visible on clear days from the university district. Einstein found it congenial in a way that Munich had never been. Switzerland was a small, neutral, multilingual country with a tradition of tolerance and a relative indifference to the kinds of national and ethnic distinctions that could make life difficult for a young Jewish man in Germany. He felt comfortable there. He would maintain a deep affection for Switzerland, for its landscapes, its practicality, its instinct for minding its own business throughout his life. The ETH was a serious institution, and the physics and mathematics program was demanding. Einstein did not find it uniformly satisfying. His chief difficulty, again, was with the parts of the curriculum that required diligent attendance and systematic note-taking, the lectures that covered standard material in a standard way, which he often skipped in favor of reading in his room or working on problems that interested him more than the assigned ones. He survived academically largely because of a classmate named Marcel Grossmann, a conscientious and generous young man who took meticulous notes and allowed Einstein to borrow them before examinations. Grossmann's notes were, on several occasions, the difference between passing and failing. They remained friends for life, and Grossmann would later play a crucial role in helping Einstein develop the mathematics of general relativity, repaying, in a sense, the intellectual debt in the opposite direction. It was at the ETH that Einstein met Mileva Maric. She was a Serbian woman, 4 years older than Einstein, the only female student in their physics cohort, and one of the most striking minds in the institution. She had grown up in a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where education for women was considerably more restricted than in Switzerland, and she had fought hard for every qualification she had. She was reserved, slightly lame from a hip condition she had had since childhood, and possessed of a mathematical intelligence that Einstein recognized and respected immediately. They became friends, then study partners, then slowly, and with some resistance from both sides, deeply in love. Their relationship alarmed both families. Hermann Einstein in particular was opposed, wanting his son to make a more conventional match. Albert and Mileva maintained the relationship anyway, through letters of extraordinary tenderness and intellectual excitement, letters in which physics and love were so entangled that it is sometimes impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. They wrote about their shared work, about the problems they were both turning over, about the life they were going to build together. It was in those years a genuine partnership of 2 serious young minds, who had found in each other both a companion and an interlocutor. Einstein graduated from the ETH in 1900. His final examinations went acceptably, if not brilliantly. More significantly, he had not managed to impress his professors sufficiently to be offered an assistantship. the standard first step on the academic career path. He applied for positions at several universities and was rejected at all of them. He was 21, newly graduated, without a job, without obvious prospects, and deeply in love with a woman his family disapproved of. Mileva, meanwhile, had taken her diploma examinations and failed. She would try again in 1901 and fail again. She was also, by 1901, pregnant with Einstein's child. The pregnancy was kept secret from almost everyone. A daughter was born in early 1902 in Serbia, at Mileva's parents' home. She was named Liserl. What became of her is one of the enduring mysteries of Einstein's life. She disappears from the historical record entirely after 1903, possibly given up for adoption, possibly dead from scarlet fever. Einstein never spoke of her publicly. No photograph of her survives. He had no permanent address, no job, no money, and a secret daughter he had never met. The world had not yet the faintest idea who he was. It was Marcel Grossmann who saved him. In the winter of 1901, when Einstein had been unsuccessfully job hunting for over a year, Grossmann mentioned his friend's situation to his father, who happened to know Friedrich Haller, the director of the Swiss Federal Patent Office in Bern. A position was becoming available, a technical expert, third class, responsible for examining applications for patents on electrical and mechanical devices and assessing their novelty and practicability. The work required a solid grounding in physics and engineering, clear thinking, and the ability to read and evaluate technical documents efficiently and without sentimentality. Grossmann's father put in a word. In June 1902, Albert Einstein was offered the position and accepted it, with a relief he did not trouble to conceal. Bern was a medieval city of arcaded streets and sandstone towers, the federal capital of Switzerland, moderate in size, quiet in character, and entirely unlike the great metropolitan centers Paris, Berlin, Vienna, where the intellectual life of Europe was most visibly concentrated. The city sat on a peninsula, formed by a bend in the Aare River, its old town rising on a ridge above the dark green water, its clock tower marking the hours for a population that valued precision and punctuality. It was a city designed for people who wished to live orderly, comfortable lives without excessive drama, and for Einstein, who had spent the previous 3 years in considerable disorder, it offered something he had not had in a long time: stability. He moved there, found a small flat, and began work at the patent office on the Speichergasse, arriving each morning at 8 and sitting at his desk amid stacks of patent applications until late afternoon. He was 23 years old. He had a steady income for the first time in his life, enough to eat properly, to buy books, to pay rent without anxiety. He wore a suit to work, which he found vaguely absurd. He was polite to his colleagues. He did his job. He also, almost immediately, married Mileva. The wedding was in January 1903, a quiet civil ceremony with 2 witnesses, Grossmann and another friend, and no family present from either side. Hermann Einstein had died in October 1902, having finally reconciled himself to the match, but not living to see it. He died still worried about his son's prospects, still uncertain whether the unusual young man he had raised would find his footing in the world. He need not have worried, though he could not have known that. Pauline Einstein attended no celebration and expressed her continued disapproval through the medium of pointed silence. Mileva and Albert set up a small household in Bern, a rented flat, simply furnished, the kind of place that students and young professionals inhabit when comfort is secondary to economy. A son, Hans Albert, was born in May 1904. A second son, Edward, would follow in 1910. Bern itself was a city that rewarded careful observation. Its long arcaded streets meant that pedestrians were always sheltered from rain and sun alike, and the city had a quality of protected intimacy, a sense that life was conducted at a human scale, that the spaces between buildings and people were neither too vast nor too compressed. Einstein walked to the patent office each morning along the same route, past the same clock tower whose bell rang the hours for the whole city. There is a thought experiment he would develop years later, in which two observers at different positions in space disagree about the timing of the same event, about whether two lightning strikes are simultaneous or not, and the image of the clock tower, of time as something publicly announced from a fixed point while other observers move relative to it, seems not entirely irrelevant to the problem he was thinking about as he walked. Whether this specific vista influenced the specific thought is impossible to know. But the city and the physics were being developed together, in the same mind, at the same time, and it would be surprising if they had no relation to each other. The social world of the young Einsteins in Bern was small but genuine. They had a few close friends, gathered occasionally for evenings of music and conversation, walked on Sundays in the hills above the city when the weather allowed. Einstein played his violin, Mileva listened, and sometimes sang. Hans Albert grew from an infant into a small, curious boy who climbed on his father's lap while his father worked and seemed not to disturb the concentration that the working required. These were not unhappy years for either of them. They were ordinary years in the best sense, the kind of years that look, from the outside, entirely unremarkable, and that contain, inside them, a secret life of extraordinary intensity. The patent office was, in retrospect, an extraordinarily fortunate place for Einstein to spend his late 20s, though this was not obvious at the time to the people who knew him. Several of his former professors, when they heard where he had ended up, regarded the posting as confirmation of their low opinion of him, a failure of academic ambition, the destination of a young man who had not worked hard enough when it mattered. They were wrong, in a way that would eventually be evident to everyone. The work was repetitive, requiring the same operations of reading, analyzing, and assessing, repeated dozens of times a day with new material. The applications that crossed his desk ranged from the genuinely ingenious to the hopelessly impractical, improvements to clockwork mechanisms, new designs for electrical switches and measuring instruments, novel approaches to the synchronization of clocks using electromagnetic signals, the transmission of electrical power over long distances. This last category was particularly relevant in the years around 1900, because the great question of whether to build electrical grids using direct current or alternating current, the battle between the systems of Edison and Tesla, was still being resolved across Europe and America, and the patent applications reflected the ferment of invention it had generated. Einstein became very good at his job, very quickly. He had a gift for cutting through the technical language of a patent application to its essential claim, for identifying whether the described device would work as stated, for spotting the hidden assumptions and the logical gaps that separated a genuine invention from a well-described impossibility. He later said that the discipline of technical evaluation, of asking relentlessly exactly what claim is being made and exactly what evidence supports it, was not unconnected to the discipline he brought to theoretical physics. He also discovered that if he worked efficiently, he could complete his official duties in less than the allotted time, leaving the remainder of the day spent in appearance bent diligently over his desk for his own thinking. He kept a small notebook hidden in his desk drawer, which he called his theoretical physics office, and into which he transcribed, in the brief intervals when he was unobserved, the ideas and calculations that occupied the greater part of his actual attention. He later called the patent office a cobbler's job that allowed him to think. It was better than an academic position would have been in one important respect. It made no demands on his originality. A university job would have required him to produce publications on schedule, to teach students, to participate in the academic politics of departmental disputes. The patent office asked only that he assess applications honestly and on time. Everything else was his own, he thought. He filled notebooks with calculations. He exchanged long letters with a small group of friends, particularly Michel Besso, an Italian-Swiss engineer who worked alongside him at the patent office, and who had one of the most productive intellectual relationships with Einstein of anyone in his life. Besso was not a great original thinker in the way that Einstein was, but he was a superb interlocutor. Someone who could follow Einstein's arguments, ask the right questions, spot the weak points, send the conversation back enriched and sharpened. He was also warm and patient and not easily discouraged by Einstein's habit of moving on from a problem before it was finished, to a different problem that had suddenly seemed more pressing. Einstein once said that he could not have found a better sounding board in all of Europe. He dedicated the first relativity paper partly to Besso, the only person thanked by name in the acknowledgments. The household at evening. Hans Albert on a blanket on the floor. Mileva at the table, a physics book open in front of her, a pen in her hand. Einstein in the kitchen or at his desk, talking aloud. He often thought aloud with Mileva, testing an argument by stating it, watching her face for the small tightening that meant she had seen a problem with it. They were, in those years, genuinely collaborative, in the way that two people can be when they have been thinking about the same things for a long time and have developed a shared language for it. Whether Mileva contributed original ideas of her own to the work, as opposed to following, criticizing, and encouraging Einstein's ideas, is a question that has generated significant historical controversy and that cannot, given the available evidence, be definitively resolved. What seems clear is that she was an intelligent and serious scientist who had been blocked from the career she had hoped for, and who channeled her remaining scientific energy into being the closest and most demanding audience for her husband's work. He was thinking, in these years, about several very large problems simultaneously. The first was the nature of light and the crisis in electromagnetic theory that the Michelson-Morley experiment had created. The second was the atomic structure of matter, which was still controversial, and the statistical behavior of atoms that might confirm or refute the atomic theory experimentally. The third was the relationship between the quantum of energy that Planck had introduced in 1900 and the actual behavior of radiation, whether Planck's quanta were merely a mathematical device or a genuine physical reality. These were three separate problems, and they were also, Einstein was beginning to suspect, three aspects of the same deeper problem, the problem of what light actually was, and how it interacted with matter, and what this implied about the structure of reality at the smallest scales. The miracle year was coming. He was 25 years old, working 6 days a week at the patent office, raising a young son with Mileva in their small Bern flat, corresponding with friends about the largest unsolved problems in physics, and filling notebooks with mathematics that nobody else had yet thought to write. He was also, in early 1905, finishing his doctoral dissertation for the University of Zurich, a paper on a new method of determining molecular dimensions, which he submitted in April. It was accepted in July. He was now Dr. Einstein. He had also, by that point, already submitted 3 other papers to the Annalen der Physik. 3 papers that would, between them, change everything about how the human race understood the universe it inhabited. The year 1905 is called Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year, and the name is justified, though miracle is perhaps the wrong word. Miracles imply the suspension of natural law. What happened in 1905 was the opposite. The discovery of deeper natural laws, more fundamental and more elegant than what had preceded them. Laws that had always been there, waiting to be found by a mind with the particular combination of courage, clarity, and mathematical imagination to see them. Einstein was 26 years old. He had a day job. He had a wife and a young son. He had no laboratory, no research budget, no graduate students, no institutional support of any kind. He had a desk at the patent office, a notebook, and a mind that could not stop working. Between March and September of 1905, he submitted 4 papers to the Annalen der Physik, the leading German physics journal. Any one of them, in an ordinary scientific career, would have been the work of a lifetime. Together, they constituted the most productive single year in the history of science, a claim that has been made many times, and that does not become less true for its familiarity. The first paper, submitted in March, concerned the photoelectric effect. When light of sufficient frequency was shown on a metal surface, the metal emitted electrons. This had been known since the late 19th century and had been investigated extensively by the German physicist Philipp Lenard, who had received the Nobel Prize for the experimental work in 1905, the same year Einstein's paper appeared. But the detailed behavior of this effect was deeply puzzling. The number of electrons emitted depended on the intensity of the light, as classical wave theory predicted, but the energy of the individual emitted electrons depended only on the frequency of the light, not on its intensity. A beam of dim violet light produced higher energy electrons than a beam of intense red light, regardless of how bright the red light was made. Classical wave theory, in which the energy of a wave was spread continuously across its surface, predicted the opposite. More intense light should mean more energetic electrons. It did not. Einstein's solution was to take Max Planck's quantum hypothesis, introduced in 1900 to solve a separate problem about the spectrum of radiation emitted by hot objects, more seriously than Planck himself had taken it. Planck had shown that radiation was emitted from hot bodies in discrete packets of energy, which he called quanta, each quantum carrying an energy proportional to the frequency of the radiation. This solved the blackbody problem beautifully, but Planck himself regarded the quanta as a mathematical artifice, a kind of accounting trick, not a statement about the physical reality of light. Einstein disagreed. He proposed that light did not merely travel in quanta, but actually was quanta, discrete particles of electromagnetic energy that traversed space as individual units, each carrying an energy equal to Planck's constant multiplied by the frequency of the light. These particles, which would later be called photons, when they struck the metal surface, transferred their energy to individual electrons in single, complete interactions. A single photon of violet light carried more energy than a single photon of red light, regardless of how many red photons there were, which explained perfectly why the energy of the emitted electrons depended on frequency and not on intensity. This was a genuinely radical proposal. It implied that light, which Maxwell had so convincingly shown to be a wave, and which produced all the wave-like effects of interference and diffraction that were well documented by experiment, was also, in some sense, a particle. The wave-particle duality that would become one of the central and most philosophically troubling features of quantum mechanics had its first clear articulation in this paper. Einstein himself described it as the most revolutionary of his 1905 papers, more radical even than relativity, because it struck at the foundations of classical physics in a way that could not be absorbed or smoothed over. It would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in 1921. The second paper, submitted in May, was on Brownian motion, the erratic, seemingly random movement of tiny particles suspended in a liquid, first systematically observed by the Scottish botanist Robert Brown in 1827, when he noticed that pollen grains in water moved continuously and unpredictably, and never satisfactorily explained in the 78 years since. Various explanations had been proposed: currents in the liquid, the effects of evaporation, the vibrations of the laboratory bench, and all had been ruled out experimentally. The motion seemed to have no cause. It was simply there, perpetual and irregular, the particles tracing paths in the water that had no pattern and no end. Einstein's analysis showed that if matter were composed of atoms, and this was still a contested hypothesis in 1905, with serious physicists on both sides, the random thermal motions of those atoms would bombard suspended particles from all sides, in a constantly fluctuating, never exactly balanced way, producing exactly the kind of irregular jostling that Brown had observed. He derived a precise mathematical formula relating the expected displacement of the particles over time to the temperature of the liquid, the size of the particles, and the size of the atoms themselves. This was both a theoretical achievement and a practical one. It gave experimenters a concrete, measurable way to test the atomic theory. The experiments were performed with great precision by the French physicist Jean Perrin over the following years, and they agreed with Einstein's formula with extraordinary accuracy. After Perrin's experiments, the existence of atoms was no longer a matter of serious scientific controversy. Wilhelm Ostwald, who had been the most prominent skeptic, a man who had spent years arguing that atoms were merely a useful fiction with no physical reality, publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong. Einstein's paper had proved, to a skeptical world, that matter was made of atoms. The third paper, submitted in June, was on what Einstein called the electrodynamics of moving bodies, which is now known as the special theory of relativity. It was the paper he had been building toward since he imagined riding alongside a light beam at 16, the paper that resolved the long-standing contradictions between Maxwell's electromagnetic theory and the mechanics of moving bodies. It began not with elaborate mathematical apparatus, but with a clear, almost conversational statement of the problem and two elegant postulates. The first: the laws of physics are the same for all observers moving at constant velocity relative to one another. The second: the speed of light in a vacuum is the same for all such observers, regardless of their motion or the motion of the source. The second postulate sounds simple. It is not. It directly contradicts the common-sense assumption that velocities add, that if you are moving toward a light source, the light should appear to approach you faster than if you were stationary. The Michelson-Morley experiment had already suggested that this common-sense assumption was wrong. Einstein built his theory on that experimental fact, not trying to explain it away, but accepting it as a fundamental truth about the universe, and working out what had to follow from it. What followed was extraordinary. Time dilation. Moving clocks run slow not as an illusion or a measurement artifact, but as a genuine physical reality. Length contraction. Moving objects are genuinely shorter in the direction of their motion. Relativity of simultaneity. Two events that appear simultaneous to one observer may occur at different times to another observer, moving relative to the first. Mass-energy equivalence. The inertia of a body increases with its kinetic energy, a relationship that pointed toward a deep connection between mass and energy. These were not hypotheses or guesses. They were theorems, proven from the two postulates with iron mathematical necessity. The universe was stranger than anyone had suspected, and the strangeness had a precise, calculable structure. The follow-up paper, submitted in September and only 3 pages long, drew out the most famous consequence. If the energy of a body changes, then its mass must change proportionally, and if you push this to its logical conclusion, a body at rest contained an energy equal to its mass multiplied by the square of the speed of light, E = mc squared. Not as a slogan, not as a bumper sticker, but as a precise physical statement that mass and energy were equivalent, interchangeable, two expressions of the same underlying quantity. A tiny amount of mass multiplied by the enormous number that is the speed of light squared, roughly 9 × 10⁻16, equaled a vast amount of energy. The sun shone because, deep in its core, hydrogen was being converted to helium, and a fraction of the mass was being released as energy, exactly as this equation implied. The full implications would not be clear for 40 years. In 1905, Einstein submitted it as a postscript, not entirely sure it was right, wondering in a letter to a friend whether the Lord was laughing at him or leading him by the nose. He was 26 years old. He had rewritten the foundations of physics. He had done it in a rented flat in Bern, by candlelight and by the early morning light, with a baby in the next room and a wife who checked his arguments and occasionally found the errors before he did. He had done it without a laboratory, without an assistant, without the support of any institution that believed in him. He had done it because the questions would not leave him alone, because the gap between what the equations said and what common sense assumed had nagged at him for a decade, and because he had the particular quality of mind, rare in any generation, that could tolerate sitting inside a contradiction long enough to find the way through it. He submitted the papers and went back to his desk at the patent office. The world did not immediately notice, but the world had changed. Recognition, when it came slowly at first, and then all at once. In the immediate aftermath of the 1905 papers, the world of physics was not immediately convulsed with excitement. The Annalen der Physik was a respected journal, but it published a great deal of material, and new papers arrived on physicists, desks in quantities that made careful reading of everything impossible. A few senior figures read the relativity paper with close attention. Max Planck, the inventor of the quantum, the man whose uncomfortable assumption Einstein had extended so radically, read it and was impressed. He assigned his assistant Max Laue to travel to Bern and verify that the author of these extraordinary papers was, in fact, a real person with genuine credentials. Laue arrived at the patent office, was directed to Einstein's desk, spoke with him for a few minutes, and went home satisfied. He had expected a professor. He had found a cheerful young man in a rumpled suit who offered him a cigar. Planck began citing the relativity paper in his own lectures. Other German physicists followed. By 1907, Einstein's reputation in the theoretical physics community was secure enough that he had begun receiving inquiries about academic positions. He was also corresponding regularly with Planck, with the Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz, whose earlier work had anticipated some aspects of the relativistic transformation equations, and who engaged with Einstein's ideas with a generosity that Einstein found deeply moving, and with various other European physicists who had recognized that something important had appeared in the Annalen. He submitted his doctoral dissertation to the University of Zurich in 1905 and received his doctorate. He applied for an academic post at the University of Bern and was turned down on the grounds that his habilitation thesis, the additional qualification required in the German academic system, was not yet complete. He submitted the relativity paper as his habilitation thesis and was initially rejected on the grounds that it was incomprehensible. He added more material and was accepted in 1908. He taught his first classes as a Privatdozent, an unpaid lecturer who collected fees directly from students in a chilly room to which, according to his own account, very few students came. He did not mind. He was still at the patent office, still thinking, still filling notebooks. In 1909, he left the patent office for good. He had been appointed extraordinary professor of theoretical physics at the University of Zurich, a genuine academic appointment with a salary, though a modest one. He was 30. He had spent 7 years as a patent examiner in Bern, and the years had been, by any measure, the most productive of his intellectual life. He left his desk at the Speichergasse for the last time in October 1909, and whatever he felt about it, he did not record. The building still stands. A small plaque marks the place where he worked. He found, to his surprise, that he enjoyed teaching. He was not a conventional teacher. He did not lecture from notes, did not follow a prepared script, did not perform for his students in the way that distinguished lecturers sometimes did. He thought out loud, in front of them, working through problems as they sat in the room, making mistakes and correcting them, following false paths and backtracking, building understanding in real time. Students who attended his classes later described the experience as unlike any other they had in their university careers. Not the transmission of finished knowledge, but the demonstration of an active mind grappling with difficult material. Some found this disorienting. The better students found it exhilarating. His personal life, meanwhile, was under increasing strain that he was either unwilling or unable to see clearly. He and Mileva had been happy in the Bern years. The shared intellectual life, the baby, the small domestic routines of a young couple who had wanted each other for a long time. But the dynamic had shifted in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. Mileva's own scientific career had ended with her failed examinations, and she had become, by the time they left Bern, primarily a mother and a housekeeper rather than an intellectual partner. Einstein, who was now being invited to conferences and corresponded with the most eminent physicists in Europe, was moving into a world that Mileva could not easily share. He was not unkind to her precisely. He was simply somewhere else, in the way that people who are entirely absorbed in their work are somewhere else even when physically present in the room. He moved again in 1911 to take up a full professorship in Prague, then the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a city of great architectural beauty and considerable social complexity, where the German-speaking Jewish professional class to which Einstein now belonged occupied an uncertain and sometimes uncomfortable position between the Czech majority and the Habsburg administration. Mileva hated Prague. Einstein was not unhappy there, but he found the social obligations of his elevated academic position tedious, and he missed the simpler life of Bern. He also found in Prague the first stirrings of what would become the general theory of relativity. Sitting in his office one afternoon, he had what he would later describe as the happiest thought of his life: the recognition that a man falling freely under gravity would feel no gravitational force, and that this implied a deep connection between gravity and the geometry of space-time. He moved back to Zurich in 1912, to the ETH where he had been a student, now returning as a full professor. And in 1914, he accepted the most prestigious physics position in the German-speaking world, a research professorship at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, with simultaneous membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences, and, crucially, no teaching obligations whatsoever. He would be paid to think. Planck had arranged it personally, and it was an extraordinary act of scientific generosity and vision. Planck understood that what Einstein needed, what would unlock the rest of what he had to give, was simply time and freedom from institutional demands. Berlin would provide both. He arrived in Berlin in the spring of 1914. Mileva arrived with him and their two sons, Hans, Albert, and Eduard. Within weeks, it was clear that the marriage was over. Einstein had, in the preceding years, renewed an acquaintance with his cousin Elsa Lowenthal, a warm, practical, good-natured woman who was recently divorced and who lived in Berlin, and who had begun corresponding with him during the Prague years in a way that had grown into something more than cousinly affection. Mileva saw, or felt, or understood what was happening. The couple separated that summer, Mileva returning to Zurich with both boys. The correspondence between Einstein and his sons over the following years is one of the genuinely sad threads in his biography. Long, careful letters from a father who loved his children and was genuinely bad at being present, who expressed his affection in writing and then did not see them for months or years at a time. Hans Albert grew up with a complicated and ultimately forgiving relationship with his famous father. Eduard, the younger son, who developed schizophrenia in his early 20s, had no such resolution available to him. In Berlin, Einstein was free. Free to think without distraction, without the demands of teaching or administration, without the daily domestic textures of family life. He was increasingly certain, standing at the edge of something larger than anything he had previously accomplished. The special theory had changed how physics thought about space and time. What he was now building, what he had been building, fitfully and with many false starts, since that afternoon in Prague, would change how it thought about gravity, about the very structure of the cosmos. The mathematics required was formidable, and Einstein was honest enough with himself to know that he needed help. He turned to Grossman, his old friend from the ETH, who had lent him the lecture notes that had carried him through his examinations, and who had since become a professor of mathematics at the ETH himself. Grossman knew the differential geometry of Bernhard Riemann, the 19th-century German mathematician, who had developed a general theory of curved surfaces and curved spaces that had been sitting in the mathematical literature for 60 years, waiting for a physicist to need it. Einstein did not know Riemannian geometry when he arrived at the ETH as a professor in 1912. He learned it, with Grossman's guidance, over the following months, and the learning was neither quick nor smooth. The mathematics was genuinely difficult. Not difficult in the way that hard calculations are difficult, but difficult in the way that a fundamentally new way of thinking is difficult, when every concept and every tool has to be rebuilt from scratch in an unfamiliar framework. There were years of wrong turns. In 1913, Einstein and Grossman published a paper, the Entwurf, or draft, theory, that they both hoped would be the completed general theory, and that turned out to be wrong in a way that took Einstein 2 more years to identify and correct. He thought for a period that he had reasons to believe that the correct equations could not be generally covariant. That is, that they could not take the same form in all coordinate systems, which was the natural symmetry requirement that the equivalence principle seemed to demand. He was wrong about this, and the error cost him 2 years. He later said that it was the greatest blunder of his professional life, which, given his subsequent decades of searching for a unified field theory, is saying something. Then, in November 1915, in 4 consecutive weekly lectures to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, it came together. The field equations of general relativity, 10 coupled nonlinear partial differential equations relating the curvature of spacetime to the distribution of matter and energy, were presented in their final correct form. Einstein had checked them against the precession of Mercury's perihelion, and they matched perfectly, without any adjustable parameter, without any tweaking. He described the feeling when he saw that the numbers came out right, as if his heart had seized with excitement. He sent a postcard to his friend Paul Ehrenfest. The theory is of incomparable beauty. The theory was beautiful. But a beautiful theory is not enough in science to command the world's attention. What science requires, what distinguishes it from philosophy, from pure mathematics, from inspired speculation, is that a theory make predictions that can be tested against reality, that can, in principle, be shown to be wrong, and that turn out, when tested, to be right. Einstein's general theory of relativity made several such predictions, and in November 1919, one of them was confirmed by British observers watching a total solar eclipse, in a way that made headlines around the world and turned a German Jewish physicist into the most famous person alive. The prediction concerned the bending of light by gravity. In general relativity, massive objects curve the geometry of spacetime in their vicinity, and light, like all physical objects, follows the straightest possible path through curved spacetime. A beam of starlight passing close to the sun, skimming its edge on its way to the Earth, would be deflected from a perfectly straight path, bent slightly toward the sun by the curvature of the spacetime geometry near it. Newton's theory of gravity also predicted a small deflection, since if you treated photons as particles with an effective mass, gravity would pull them just as it pulled everything else. But Einstein's predicted deflection was exactly twice the Newtonian value. The additional factor came from the curvature of space itself, a feature of general relativity that Newton's theory did not include and could not account for. The difference between the two predictions was, in principle, measurable. Measuring it would tell you which theory was correct. The practical difficulty was enormous. The only way to observe the bending of starlight by the sun was during a total solar eclipse, when the moon's disk blocked the sun's blinding face and allowed the stars near the sun's edge to be photographed in the suddenly darkened sky. Their positions in the eclipse photograph could then be compared with photographs of the same region of sky taken 6 months later, when the sun had moved away and the stars were visible in a dark sky. Any shift in the apparent positions of the stars near the sun's limb would be the signature of the deflection. The shifts predicted by Einstein were tiny, at most about 1.75 arc-seconds for a star at the sun's limb, a quantity smaller than the apparent diameter of a pinhead held at arm's length. The test had been planned once before and interrupted. An expedition sent to observe the eclipse of August 1914, which would have been perfectly positioned to test Einstein's predictions, had been caught in the Crimea by the outbreak of the First World War before any useful observations could be made. The German and British scientists who might have collaborated on the measurement found themselves, over the following 4 years, on opposite sides of the most destructive conflict in human history. The war had also nearly consumed Einstein's life, not physically, since he remained in Berlin, but morally and emotionally. He had signed, early in the conflict, a document protesting German militarism and the German invasion of Belgium, at a time when virtually all of his academic colleagues were signing manifestos in support of the war, and celebrating the righteousness of German arms. He had done this alone, knowing that it would make him unpopular, knowing that the spirit of the times was entirely against him, knowing that most of the people he respected had gone the other way. He watched the industrial slaughter of the trenches, the millions of young men fed into the mechanism of artillery and gas and wire, from his study in Berlin, with a horror and a despair that never quite left him. He became, in these years, a committed pacifist, not in the naive sense of someone who believed that war could be wished away, but in the sense of someone who had understood, viscerally and intellectually, what nationalism and militarism produced when they were given free rein. In November 1915, in the midst of the war, Einstein had completed the general theory and presented it in 4 consecutive lectures to the Prussian Academy. The theory predicted the bending of light. It also predicted the precession of the perihelion of Mercury, a tiny, long-observed anomaly in Mercury's orbit that Newton's theory had failed to explain, and that Einstein's theory, without any adjustment or free parameter, predicted exactly. When he calculated the result and found that it matched the observed anomaly perfectly, he was so agitated with excitement that he could not work for 3 days. He described the experience as if something had burst inside him. The eclipse of the 29th of May, 1919, offered the next opportunity for the light-bending test. 2 British expeditions were organized, one to the island of Principe off the west coast of Africa, one to Sobral in northern Brazil, to photograph the stars around the sun during totality. The expeditions had been championed above all by the astronomer Arthur Stanley Eddington, a Quaker, a pacifist, and a man of deep scientific integrity who had strong personal reasons, beyond the purely scientific, for wanting the test to be conducted. He had resisted conscription during the war on grounds of conscience, and the prospect of a British expedition confirming a German theory, demonstrating that the bonds of science transcended the animosities of nations, appealed to him powerfully. Science, he believed, was one of the few truly international human activities, and the eclipse expedition was a chance to prove it. The observations at Principe were complicated by cloud. Eddington spent the minutes of totality watching the clouds with a tension he later described as almost unbearable, catching glimpses of the corona through gaps, making exposures when the sky allowed, not knowing until the photographic plates were developed whether anything useful had been recorded. He had 16 usable plates from Principe. He reduced the data himself, measuring the positions of the stars on each plate with a micrometer, and comparing them with reference plates taken months before. The Brazil expedition at Sobral had clearer skies and obtained better data with a larger instrument. The Sobral results in particular were unambiguous. The plates were brought back to England, measured with painstaking care over several months, and the results were analyzed by Dyson and Eddington together. The deflection values measured at both sites agreed with Einstein's prediction, within the experimental uncertainty, not with Newton's. The result was, within its error bars, decisive. Space-time was curved. Light followed the curvature. Newton had described the world accurately enough for most practical purposes. But at the level of precision that the eclipse had probed, the world was not what Newton had said it was. Eddington later wrote about the moment he first realized that the plates confirmed Einstein's theory. He was measuring them alone in his study, late at night, and when the numbers came clear, he sat for a long moment without moving. He had spent years working toward this measurement, had organized the expedition, had weathered the cloud at Principe, and the anxiety of the months of data reduction. And now the answer was there, in the numbers on the plate, The universe was, as Einstein had said it was. He would later describe it as the greatest moment of his life. He was a religious man, a Quaker, and he believed, not as a metaphor but as a genuine conviction, that in those numbers he had glimpsed the mind of the Creator. The announcement came at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society in London on the 6th of November 1919. The room was full. Scientists, journalists, and curious members of the educated public, all aware that something important was about to be said. The Astronomer Royal, Sir Frank Dyson, presented the results. The deflection values measured at both sites agreed with Einstein's prediction, not Newton's. The president of the Royal Society, J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron, a man not given to theatrical hyperbole, described the result as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human thought. Newton's mechanics, which had stood for 230 years as the unquestioned framework of all physical science, had been superseded. A new framework had taken its place. The portrait of Newton on the wall of the Society's meeting room looked down at the proceedings, with what a journalist present described as the expression of a man who has just been told something he did not expect. The Times of London ran a headline the following morning: "Revolution in Science, New Theory of the Universe, Newtonian Ideas Overthrown." The story spread to every newspaper in the world within days. In New York, in Paris, in Tokyo and Buenos Aires and Cape Town and Calcutta, people read the name Albert Einstein and understood, or thought they understood, that a man in Germany had changed the human race's conception of the cosmos. The fact that almost none of them could have explained what he had actually done did not diminish the excitement, and may in fact have intensified it. There is a particular quality of public fascination that attaches itself to ideas that are genuine and important, but beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. A reverence for the mystery that is at least as powerful as the reverence for the explanation. Einstein was in Berlin when the news came. In his apartment on Heberlandstrasse, he received a telegram from Lorenz. He showed it to Elsa, who asked him what he would have said if the measurements had gone the other way. He told her that in that case he would have felt sorry for the Lord, because the theory was correct. He was not joking, or not entirely. He had been confident since 1915 that the field equations were right, and the eclipse confirmed a prediction he had already been certain of. What surprised him was not the physics. It was the world's reaction to the physics. The telegrams, the reporters at the door, the invitations from every country, the sudden and vertiginous sense that he had become, without quite intending to, the most famous man alive. The years between the eclipse announcement of November 1919 and Hitler's assumption of power in January 1933 were the years in which Einstein was most fully a citizen of the world, most visible, most engaged with the full range of human concerns that his prominence made accessible to him, and also the years in which the world made it most difficult for him to simply be a scientist. He traveled constantly. He lectured in England and France, in the United States and Japan, in Palestine and Argentina and Brazil. He met heads of state, philosophers, novelists, and musicians. He sat for photographs with a patience that occasionally wore thin, gave interviews to journalists who could not always follow what he was explaining, attended dinners at which he was the guest of honor, and at which he was expected to say something worthy of the occasion. He carried his violin with him everywhere, on ocean liners, in hotel rooms, in the houses of strangers who had offered him hospitality, and played it late at night when the obligations of the day had finally released him. He was not simply a passive object of fame. He used it deliberately, with a clarity about its mechanics that coexisted, interestingly, with his obvious discomfort at its personal costs. He wrote and spoke on pacifism and international disarmament, arguing that the lesson of the Great War was that national sovereignty and competitive armament were incompatible with the survival of European civilization. He wrote and spoke on Zionism and on the situation of Jewish people in Europe, supporting the idea of a Jewish cultural and intellectual center in Palestine while expressing reservations about the political form it should take and deep concern about the treatment of the Arab population already living there. He lent his name to causes, signed manifestos, corresponded with governments. He understood that his fame was a resource, and he spent it on the things he believed in. He met Charlie Chaplin in Los Angeles in 1931 at the premiere of City Lights, and the two walked into the theater together to a standing ovation. Chaplin leaned over and said, with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about the difference between his own celebrity and his companions, "They cheer for me because they all understand me, and they cheer for you because no one understands you." Einstein found this observation funny and accurate, and repeated it to several people. He also met the Queen of Belgium, with whom he formed a genuine friendship that lasted for the rest of his life and is documented in a remarkable series of letters. He played chamber music with Queen Elizabeth on at least one occasion, the two of them working through a Beethoven sonata in a palace drawing room, while courtiers and secretaries waited at a respectful distance. He met President Harding in Washington and found him puzzled but polite. He met George Bernard Shaw at a dinner in London and engaged in a conversation about pacifism that Shaw later described as the most stimulating he had had in years. He met the kinds of people that 20th century fame delivered to one's door, and he was, by all accounts, genuinely interested in some of them and amiably inattentive to the rest. The anti-Semitism had been present from the beginning of his public prominence, even before the eclipse. In the years immediately following 1919, a campaign had been organized in Germany, partly motivated by genuine scientific disagreement, but fueled by something considerably uglier, to discredit the theory of relativity as Jewish physics. The term carried a specific political charge in the Germany of the early 1920s, a country in the grip of economic crisis, political instability, and the humiliation of military defeat. Jewish physics was not merely wrong, but actively dangerous, a corruption of the pure rationalism of true German science by the deceptive, overly abstract thinking that anti-Semitic ideology associated with Jewish intellectuals. The campaign was led by two German physicists, Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark, both of them Nobel laureates and both of them moving rapidly toward National Socialism. Einstein attended a public meeting at which his work was attacked, and sat through it with a composure that various witnesses described as remarkable, occasionally laughing at a particularly extravagant misrepresentation of what he had actually done. He was also, in these years, engaged in the deepest scientific controversy of his life: quantum mechanics. The theory that he had helped to start with his 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect had been developed in the decade after the war into a complete and extraordinarily powerful mathematical framework by Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Paul Dirac, Max Born, and others. It was, by every measure of scientific success, a triumph. It explained the structure of atoms, the spectra of elements, the properties of chemical bonds, the behavior of electrons in metals, and much else besides, with a precision that had never previously been achieved in physics. Einstein did not like it. Or rather, he accepted that it was correct, that its predictions agreed with experiment, that it had solved problems that nothing else had solved. What he could not accept was what it seemed to say about the nature of reality. Quantum mechanics, and the interpretation developed primarily by Bohr and his colleagues in Copenhagen, said that physical quantities did not have definite values prior to measurement. The position of an electron was not a fact that the electron carried with it through space. It was a probability distribution, a cloud of potential positions that condensed into a single definite value only at the moment of measurement. This was not merely a limitation on what could be known, not just an epistemological constraint, but a statement about what was real. The electron, literally, did not have a position until it was measured. Reality, at the quantum level, was not determinate but probabilistic, not definite but potential. God does not play dice. The phrase, in various formulations, appears in his letters from this period, and it captures his position accurately. He believed that the universe had a definite reality independent of whether anyone was observing it, that the probabilities of quantum mechanics reflected human ignorance of a deeper deterministic layer rather than genuine indeterminacy in nature, and that quantum mechanics was correct as far as it went but incomplete. That there was, beneath its probabilistic surface, a deeper level of description that would restore the definiteness that quantum theory had removed. He and Bohr debated this through the 1920s and 1930s, at a series of international Solvay conferences in Brussels, where the leading physicists of the age gathered to discuss the foundations of the new theory. The debates were conducted with great courtesy and genuine mutual respect. Bohr and Einstein admired each other deeply as scientists and as human beings, whatever their disagreements. But they produced no resolution. Einstein would present a thought experiment designed to show that quantum mechanics was inconsistent or incomplete. Bohr would find the flaw in the argument, usually after a night of anxious reflection. Einstein would modify the argument. Bohr would find the new flaw. The process went on for years. The most famous of these exchanges concerned what Einstein called the photon box experiment, an intricate thought experiment involving a box containing radiation, a shutter controlled by a clock, and the apparent possibility of measuring the energy and the timing of an emitted photon simultaneously with arbitrary precision, in violation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. He presented it at the Sixth Solvay Conference in 1930, and Bohr was visibly shaken by it. He went to bed that night believing, genuinely, that Einstein might have found a fatal flaw. By morning, Bohr had his answer. The resolution lay in Einstein's own general theory of relativity, in the way that gravity affects the rate of a clock. Einstein had, in trying to defeat quantum mechanics, inadvertently provided the instrument of his own refutation. He accepted the response graciously, but was not persuaded that the deeper issue had been resolved. By the consensus of subsequent physicists, Bohr won the debates. But Einstein's deeper worry, expressed most clearly in the 1935 EPR paper, written with Podolsky and Rosen, which identified what he called the spooky action at a distance implied by quantum entanglement, has never been fully laid to rest. John Bell's theorem, published in 1964, showed that quantum mechanics made predictions that any local hidden variable theory must fail to reproduce, and subsequent experiments confirmed quantum mechanics on every test. Einstein's preferred alternative, a deterministic theory that would restore definite values to physical quantities, does not exist, or at least has not been found. The universe appears, at the quantum scale, to be genuinely probabilistic, But the question of what this means, what the wave function collapse actually is, what the relationship is between the mathematical formalism and physical reality, remains contested and alive. The Weimar Republic was failing. The Great Depression had struck Germany with particular ferocity, and the democratic institutions that had governed the country since 1918 were being torn apart by extremists on both sides. Einstein watched from Berlin and then from the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, where he spent the winter of 1932 to 1933 as a visiting professor. He was in Pasadena when Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. He stopped in Belgium on his return voyage, resigned from the Prussian Academy, renounced his German citizenship, and made his way, eventually, to Princeton. He was 54 years old. He left behind his furniture, his books, his papers, the Berlin that had been his home for nearly 20 years. He did not go back. Princeton was a small, elegant university town in central New Jersey, a place of wide lawns and Georgian brick buildings, of tree-lined streets and academic calm, very different from the great cities. Berlin, Zurich, Prague, London, where Einstein had spent his working life. He arrived in October 1933 with Elsa, 2 assistants, and the knowledge that he was not going back. He settled in a modest white clapboard house at 112 Mercer Street, a short walk from the Institute for Advanced Study, and he arranged his life in Princeton with the simplicity that had always suited him. The morning walk to the office, the afternoon at the blackboard, the evening at home with his violin, and the long, quiet nights in which the equations continued to develop themselves behind his closed eyes. Princeton was, in certain respects, a strange place for the world's most famous scientist to live out his exile. It was comfortable and safe, and entirely removed from the catastrophe that had consumed Europe. The wide streets and the elm trees and the well-maintained houses had nothing in common with the Berlin he had left or the continent he could not return to. He was aware of the contrast and was not entirely comfortable with it. He worked hard in those Princeton years to make his comfort useful, to use the security and the prominence that America provided in the service of people who had neither. He was, in Princeton, a figure of extraordinary public prominence in a town that took its academic life seriously, but was not accustomed to having the most famous person in the world living within walking distance of the post office. He was recognized on the street, stopped by visitors, photographed by tourists, invited to every event of any distinction that happened within reach. He attended many fewer than he was invited to, but he was not a recluse. He walked through town daily, stopped to talk with anyone who approached him with genuine curiosity, and was reportedly more willing to explain physics to school children who knocked on his door than to most of the journalists who called his office. There is a story, told in various forms, of a small girl who came to him regularly for help with her mathematics homework, and whose mother apologized for taking up his time. He told her not to worry, that the girl helped him more than he helped her by providing him with cookies. He was also, from his first days in Princeton, deeply engaged with the catastrophe unfolding in Europe. He wrote letters, made appeals, signed documents, used his connections in the American academic world to help European refugees, Jewish scholars, political dissidents, anyone fleeing the expanding darkness, find positions and visas. He had no institutional power and no political influence in the formal sense, but his name carried weight, and he used it wherever it could do good. He corresponded with Eleanor Roosevelt about refugee policy. He wrote to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He helped individual people, one by one, in ways that rarely made the newspapers but that changed specific lives. Elsa died in December 1936 in Princeton of heart and kidney disease. She had been ill for most of the year, and her death, when it came, was not entirely unexpected, but it left Einstein more alone than he had been in a long time. His sister Maya came to Princeton after her husband's death in Switzerland and lived with Albert until her own death in 1951, keeping him company and keeping house and connecting him in the evenings to the shared world of their common childhood. The Munich garden, the Munich school, the parents who had long since died, the European life that no longer existed for either of them in the form they had known it. His secretary, Helen Dukas, who had joined his household in Berlin in 1928 and who would remain with him for the rest of his life, managed the overwhelming correspondence and the social obligations, with a quiet efficiency that Einstein was genuinely grateful for and occasionally oblivious to. The most consequential event of his Princeton years came in the summer of 1939, when he was visited at his summer cottage on Long Island by Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, both European physicists who had fled Germany and who brought alarming news. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in Berlin had recently succeeded in splitting a uranium nucleus. Nuclear fission had been achieved, and it was now, in principle, possible to construct a chain reaction in which each fission event triggered further fissions, releasing energy in quantities that dwarfed anything achievable by chemical means. The Germans were aware of this. Szilard and Wigner believed they might already be pursuing a weapon. Einstein understood immediately. The equation he had written in 1905, mass times the speed of light squared, was the equation that described where the energy came from. The tiny reduction in mass when a uranium nucleus split, multiplied by the enormous factor of c squared, produced an energy release that was, on the scale of weapons, essentially without limit. He had always known, abstractly, that the equation described a vast reservoir of energy locked in matter. He had not anticipated the form in which that reservoir would first be opened. He signed the letter. It was addressed to President Roosevelt, carefully written by Szilard, with Einstein's input and authority, describing the scientific situation and the danger it represented, and recommending that the government take an interest in nuclear chain reactions and in securing supplies of uranium ore. It was the letter that initiated the sequence of events, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, that would become the Manhattan Project. Einstein himself did not work on the Manhattan Project. His political history made him a security risk to the satisfaction of the project's administrators, and he was not cleared for access to classified information. He learned of the Hiroshima bombing, the destruction of a city of hundreds of thousands of people by a single weapon, from the radio on the morning of August 7, 1945. He said in German a single word, "Ach," the sound of a man hearing the thing he had most feared. He spent the remaining decade of his life in a state of deep moral seriousness about the nuclear age. He spoke, in public and in private, with an urgency that went beyond the measured tone of his academic writing. He co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists in 1945, which advocated for international control of nuclear weapons and against their proliferation. He wrote, in 1947, an article in the Atlantic Monthly arguing that the United Nations needed to be given genuine supranational authority, that the existence of nuclear weapons made national sovereignty in its traditional form too dangerous to preserve. He made himself unpopular with American authorities, who found his politics inconvenient in the early Cold War years, and he was investigated by the FBI, which compiled a file on him of remarkable length and equally remarkable uselessness. He was also still working on physics. He sat at his blackboard at the Institute, still pursuing the unified field theory that had occupied him since the 1920s. The attempt to bring gravity and electromagnetism together in a single mathematical framework that might also, he hoped, account for quantum phenomena at a deeper level. He worked with various collaborators, produced papers that were received with respectful skepticism by the physics community, and kept working. The problem was not solved. It is not solved today. The search for a quantum theory of gravity, a theory that reconciles the smooth geometry of general relativity with the probabilistic machinery of quantum mechanics, is one of the central unsolved problems of 21st century theoretical physics, and there are those who believe it will require ideas as radical as anything Einstein found in 1905 or 1915. His younger son Edward remained in Switzerland in psychiatric care throughout the Princeton years. Einstein visited him rarely. The Atlantic Ocean was between them for most of the time, and the visits when they did occur were difficult, painful, shot through with the guilt of a father who had been absent when presence mattered most. Edward painted, listened to music, and lived the diminished life of someone whose mind had turned against him. He died in 1965, in Zurich, 10 years after his father. He never saw Princeton. He never saw his father's office at the Institute. In February 1955, 2 months before his death, Einstein co-signed with Bertrand Russell a manifesto addressed to the governments and peoples of the world, calling for international cooperation to reduce the danger of nuclear war. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto, as it became known, was released in July 1955, after Einstein's death. His was the last signature collected, and he signed it knowing he was dying. It led eventually to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, in which scientists from both sides of the Cold War met to discuss the dangers of weapons of mass destruction. It was not nothing, it was not enough. He knew it was not enough, and he signed it anyway. He died on the 18th of April 1955 in Princeton Hospital of a ruptured aortic aneurysm. He was 76 years old. He had been hospitalized 2 days before, had declined surgery, telling his doctor that it was tasteless to prolong life artificially, and had asked that his work be brought to him. He was working on a speech for Israeli Independence Day and on the unified field equations on the last night of his life. His last words were spoken in German to a nurse who spoke no German and were not heard. He had asked for no funeral, no grave, no monument. His ashes were scattered in the Delaware River. His brain was removed without family permission by the pathologist who performed the autopsy, an act of violation that would have struck Einstein, who had asked to be left in peace after his death, as entirely characteristic of the world's inability to let him alone. The brain was studied by various scientists over the following decades for evidence of the anatomical basis of his genius. Nothing conclusive was found, whatever it was that had let him see what others could not see. The particular configuration of neurons and connections that had looked at a falling apple and thought about the moon, that had imagined riding alongside a light beam and seen the structure of space-time, was not visible in a glass jar. He had once written, near the end of his life, that a human being was part of the whole that we call the universe, a part limited in time and space, experiencing himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. The task, he said, was to free ourselves from this delusion, to widen our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. He did not always succeed at this himself. He was not a saint, and he did not claim to be. He was a man who had looked very hard at the world, and had seen, in it, a beauty and an order that he never quite got over finding astonishing. He had done what he came to do. The compass needle still points north. The stars still bend their light around the sun, by exactly the amount he said they would. The universe is still, at its deepest level, stranger and more beautiful than common sense suggests. And somewhere in the mathematical structure of space-time, in the equations that he wrote on a blackboard in Berlin in the autumn of 1915, equations that a few dozen people in the world could then read, and that every physicist in the world now knows, something of what he saw, and what he understood, and what he gave, is still there, waiting for anyone patient enough, and quiet enough, and curious enough to find it.